She was the most powerful woman in Westbridge, worth $3 billion, feared in every boardroom, untouchable by anyone. Until the night three armed men stepped out of a black sedan in an empty parking garage and told her to hand over everything. Her security team had vanished. Her phone was dead. Her car wouldn't start. And the only person standing between Cassandra Bellamy and the men who wanted her silenced forever was a quiet maintenance worker holding a wrench. A man nobody in that building truly knew. A man who hadn't been just a maintenance worker for a very long time. Well, if you found this story, don't leave yet. Subscribe to this channel and follow every part of this story to the very end, because what happens next will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's begin. The underground garage at Meridian Corporate Plaza closed at 9. By 9:15, the last of the office workers had filtered out through the stairwells and the elevator banks, and the only sounds left were the hum of fluorescent lighting, the distant groan of a ventilation shaft, and the particular silence that large empty spaces make when they are pretending to be safe. Gideon Rourke noticed the SUV first. He was doing his final sweep of level B2, checking the drainage grates, noting a section of painted curb that had been scraped by a careless driver sometime during the afternoon, writing it down in the small spiral notebook he kept in his breast pocket. It was the kind of work that people passed without seeing, the kind of man people looked through without registering. He had, over the past 4 years, become very good at being looked through. The SUV was a black Cadillac Escalade, late model, parked in one of the reserved executive spaces near the elevator bank. It sat at a slightly wrong angle, not dramatically off, just a few degrees, the way a vehicle looks when the driver pulled in too fast and didn't bother to correct. The engine was silent. The hazard lights were not on. But the driver's door was open just enough that the interior dome light cast a thin wedge of amber across the concrete floor. Gideon stopped walking. He stood there for a moment, his notebook in one hand, his pen in the other, and he studied the scene the way a man studies something that doesn't quite add up. 11 years of service had given him an instinct for wrongness. Not a feeling exactly, more like a calculation his brain completed faster than his conscious mind could follow. Open door. No hazard lights. Executive space. 9:15 on a Thursday. He walked toward the vehicle. The woman was standing beside the rear passenger door with her arms crossed over her chest, her phone pressed against her ear, her expression moving through a controlled sequence of frustration and forced composure. She was dressed in a charcoal blazer and dark slacks, heels that had probably cost more than Gideon's truck payment, her dark hair pulled back in the kind of arrangement that had been precise 12 hours ago and was now showing the damage of a very long day. He recognized her immediately. Cassandra Bellamy, founder and CEO of Bellamy Medical Technologies, the company that occupied floors 14 through 19 of the building above them. Her face had been on the cover of 2 business publications that Gideon had seen in the break room over the past year, and the complex's general manager had sent a company-wide memo 6 months ago reminding all facilities staff that Ms. Bellamy's vehicles had reserved priority access to the executive spaces on B2. She had not, in 4 years of Gideon working in this building, ever acknowledged him. That was fine, he didn't need her to. She lowered the phone from her ear and stared at the screen, and Gideon saw the moment she registered that it was doing nothing. No signal bars, no Wi-Fi indicator, just a blank, unresponsive face. "Excuse me," he said. She looked up sharply, and for a fraction of a second her whole body went tense, the instinctive fear of a woman alone in a parking garage who has just heard a man's voice behind her. He had seen that reaction before. He kept his hands visible, his posture open, his distance respectful. "Sorry to startle you," he said. "I'm facilities. Gideon Rourke, maintenance supervisor. I do the final sweep down here every evening." He nodded at the SUV. "Looks like you're having some trouble." She studied him for a moment. Whatever she was reading in his face apparently cleared the initial alarm, because her shoulders dropped slightly and she let out a breath through her nose that was not quite a sigh. "The car won't start," she said, "and I cannot get a signal down here for some reason, which has never been a problem before. There's a repeater on the north wall that boosts cellular in this level. I can check whether it's offline." He looked at the Escalade. "Can I take a look at the vehicle?" She hesitated. Not long, maybe 2 seconds, and then stepped aside. Gideon set his notebook on the roof of the car and opened the hood. He moved methodically, not rushing, checking the obvious things first. Battery connections, fuses, ground cable. The engine compartment was clean and well maintained. This was a recent vehicle, well serviced. He found it in under a minute. The negative battery cable had been disconnected. Not corroded loose, not vibrated free over months of driving. Disconnected cleanly, the terminal pushed back just far enough that the circuit was broken, in a way that would look like a mechanical failure to anyone who didn't look closely. Gideon crouched there with his hand near the cable and did not touch anything for a moment. He turned this over carefully in his mind. The cable hadn't disconnected itself. Someone had opened this hood in a secured executive parking level on a vehicle belonging to one of the building's most prominent tenants and deliberately disabled it. And then someone had also somehow interfered with the cellular repeater on the north wall. He thought about the security desk on level B1. On his way down, the desk had been empty. Marcus, who worked Thursday evenings, had not been at his post. He thought about all of this in approximately 4 seconds. Then he reconnected the cable, lowered the hood, and turned back toward Cassandra Bellamy with a neutral expression. "Battery connection worked loose," he said. "It happens on these models sometimes after a lot of stop and go in cold weather. Should start now." She looked at him without complete certainty, as though she wasn't fully buying it, but didn't have a specific reason to push back. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate it." "Give it a try." She got behind the wheel. The engine turned over immediately, the dashboard lighting up, the heat beginning to push through the vents. He saw her exhale with visible relief. Gideon stepped back and picked up his notebook. He looked toward the exit ramp at the far end of the garage. A black sedan was parked across the base of the ramp. It had not been there 20 minutes ago when he had come down from B1. He was certain of that. He made note of vehicles as a matter of habit, not obsessively, not with anxiety, just the way a man who spent 11 years operating in environments where an out-of-place vehicle could mean the difference between coming home and not coming home tends to notice these things. The sedan's engine was running. He could see the exhaust in the cold air at the base of the ramp. 3 men got out. They were dressed in civilian clothes, dark jackets, unremarkable, but Gideon read them in the first 3 seconds of watching them move. The way they spread out without needing to discuss it. The way the one on the left angled slightly to cover the stairwell door. The way the one in the center moved with the easy authority of someone who had done this kind of thing before, and had never once been particularly worried about the outcome. These were not security guards. These were not building management. Gideon moved back toward Cassandra's window. "Miss Bellamy," he said quietly, "I need you to stay in the car. Lock the doors." She had been adjusting the climate controls. She stopped. "What?" "Lock the doors," he said again. "Right now, please." Something in his voice, the flatness of it, the absence of apology, made her look at him differently than she had been looking at him. She looked at his face. Then she looked where he was looking. The 3 men were 30 yards out and closing. She locked the doors. The center man, broad across the shoulders, a face that had been broken at least once and had set imperfectly, raised a hand in a gesture that was almost friendly. "Miss Bellamy," he called out. His voice carried easily in the concrete space. "We're going to need you to step out of the vehicle." Gideon positioned himself between the car and the approaching men. He held his notebook in his left hand. His right hand was at his side. "Building's closed," he said. "You'll need to leave." The man looked at Gideon with the specific expression of someone who has been handed an inconvenience they find mildly irritating rather than actually challenging. "We're not here for you, friend. Step aside." "I'm the facility supervisor on this level," Gideon said. "I'm asking you to exit the building." The man on the left had continued moving and was now trying to arc around toward the passenger side of the Escalade. Gideon watched this in his peripheral vision without moving his eyes from the center man. "Last time," the center man said. His voice had dropped the performance of friendliness. "Move." Inside the Escalade, Cassandra had her phone out and was staring at the dead screen. Gideon could see her through the windshield, jaw tight, working very hard to remain composed. He had seen that expression on people before, the ones who held it together instead of breaking apart. He had always found that quality more interesting than confidence. "Ms. Bellamy," the center man called, changing his angle. "The drive. Hand it over, and this stays simple." Gideon heard the sound of the driver's door handle being tried. The man on the left had reached the passenger side, was working his way around. The man on the right had stopped moving and was simply watching, hands loose, weight forward. He had perhaps 5 seconds before the geometry of this got complicated. Gideon moved. Not dramatically, not with announcement. He stepped toward the left, putting himself between the approaching man and the front of the Escalade, and when the man reached for him, a grab at the shoulder, the reflex of someone accustomed to physical intimidation working reliably. Gideon wasn't where the grab expected him to be. He used the man's momentum and the side of the vehicle to redirect him, sharply, into the concrete pillar 2 feet to the left. The sound was not quiet. The center man came forward. Gideon was already moving, putting the hood of the Escalade between them, buying distance and angle. The garage was not a place for prolonged confrontation, too many variables, and he was alone. The objective was not to win a fight. The objective was to create enough disorder to change the math. "Get in the passenger seat," he said, loudly enough for Cassandra to hear through the glass. "Passenger seat, now." He heard the lock cycle. He heard her moving across the center console. The center man came around the front of the vehicle, and Gideon let him close the gap, then stepped inside the reach and used the man's own forward drive to send him sideways into the driver's side mirror. The man went down hard on one knee, more surprised than hurt. It bought 8 seconds. Gideon got the driver's door open, dropped into the seat, and had the Escalade in reverse before the door was fully closed. The man on the right had to throw himself sideways to avoid the bumper. Gideon swung the vehicle in a hard arc across the open floor of B2, pointed it at the secondary exit ramp on the east side. A narrower ramp, rarely used, accessed through a gate that required a building facilities key, and drove. "Your seatbelt," he said. Beside him, Cassandra Bellamy pulled the belt across her chest with hands that were not entirely steady. She said nothing for a long moment as he navigated the ramp, keyed the gate, and brought the Escalade up into the bitter cold of the West Bridge night. Then she said, "Who are you?" Gideon checked the mirrors. The street behind them was empty. He turned north, away from the main avenue, onto a residential street where the Escalade would not be the only large vehicle and would not be easily followed. "Gideon Rourke," he said, "maintenance supervisor." She looked at him. "That is not what a maintenance supervisor does." He didn't answer immediately. "I was watching the intersections, reading the traffic pattern, making decisions about route." "What was on the drive they mentioned?" he asked. A pause. "Financial records. Documentation of transactions I found 3 weeks ago that I've been trying to verify before taking to the board." "Fraud." Another pause. Longer. "Yes." "Is the drive on you right now?" "Yes." "Then you can't go home tonight," he said, "and you can't go to any hotel that your company's name has an account with." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city moved past. Lit storefronts, the orange wash of street lamps on snow-dusted sidewalks, the ordinary machinery of a Thursday night that had no idea what was happening inside this vehicle. "Where are we going?" she asked. Gideon thought of Maya at home, probably finishing her homework at the kitchen table, probably having heated up the soup he'd left in the refrigerator, probably annoyed that he was running late. "Somewhere safe," he said. "And the last place anyone would look for you, Chad." The house on Aldermore Street was nothing. That was the precise word for it. Nothing that announced itself. Nothing that drew the eye. A 1960s ranch-style home with aluminum siding the color of old snow. A front porch that needed 2 boards replaced. A pickup truck in the driveway that was 10 years old and had been maintained with the obsessive care of a man who could not afford to replace it. The neighborhood was quiet, in the way that working neighborhoods are quiet in winter. Everyone inside, lights behind curtains, the occasional dog complaint from a yard down the block. Cassandra looked at it as Gideon pulled the Escalade to the curb. She did not say anything, which he appreciated. "My daughter's home," he said. "She's 9. Her name is Maya. I need to tell her something before you come in." "Your daughter," Cassandra repeated. "Yes." "You have a 9-year-old daughter." "I do." She looked at the house again, and then back at him, and he could see her assembling a revised version of whatever picture she'd started forming of him in the garage. He didn't help her with it. "Okay," she said. He went in first. Maya was at the kitchen table exactly as he'd imagined, a worksheet spread in front of her, a mug of something she'd heated herself beside it. Not the soup, apparently, but the hot chocolate mix she was technically supposed to ask permission for. She looked up when he came in, registered the lateness of the hour, and immediately deployed the expression she had inherited from her mother, the one that communicated several things simultaneously without saying any of them out loud. "I know," Gideon said. "I'm late. I'm sorry. I have someone with me, a woman from the building. She's had a hard night and she needed somewhere to go. Is that okay?" Maya considered this with the particular gravity of a 9-year-old taking a question seriously. "Is she hurt?" "No, just shaken up." "Does she want hot chocolate?" "Probably." Maya nodded as though this settled things, and went to get another mug from the cabinet. When Cassandra came through the door and stood in the narrow entryway of the ranch house, $3 billion net worth, charcoal blazer, heels that had no business being on that linoleum floor, Maya looked at her without any sign of recognition or awe, with only the frank assessment of a child reading a new person for the first time. "Hi," Maya said. "You can borrow my sweatshirt if you want. You look cold." Something moved across Cassandra Bellamy's face that Gideon had never seen in a business magazine photograph. "Thank you," she said. "I'd like that very much." They sat at the kitchen table, Maya doing her worksheet, Cassandra in Maya's oversized Westbridge elementary sweatshirt, hands wrapped around a mug, while Gideon stood at the kitchen counter and thought. He thought about the cable. He thought about the timing. He thought about 3 men who had known which vehicle, which level, which exit. He thought about the security desk that had been empty. He laid his notebook on the counter and looked at what he'd written without writing it. Someone had known Cassandra Bellamy's schedule tonight. Not approximately. Exactly. They had known when she would leave, which vehicle she would take, which level it was parked on. That kind of knowledge didn't come from surveillance. It came from someone inside. He looked over at Cassandra. She was watching Maya work on her math, and the expression on her face was something between exhaustion and a quality he couldn't name, something like the particular sadness of a person who has just entered a room they didn't know they were missing. "Miss Bellamy," he said quietly. She looked up. "The people who came tonight," he said, "they weren't waiting outside, they were waiting inside." She set the mug down. "Someone told them when you'd leave," he said. "Someone with access to your schedule, your vehicle assignment, and the building security rotation." The color changed in her face. Not dramatically, just a slight withdrawal, the way warmth leaves a room rather than crashes out of it. "You're saying someone in my company." "I'm saying somebody who knew your exact movements tonight set this up." He kept his voice level. "That's not a guess. That's what the evidence suggests." She sat with that. Across the table, Maya erased something vigorously and blew the debris off the page. Outside, the wind came off the mountains the way it always did in February. With no particular malice, just the indifference of cold things that do not notice the warmth they're taking. Cassandra picked up the mug again. Her hands, Gideon noticed, had stopped shaking. "All right," she said. It wasn't agreement exactly. It was something closer to the sound of a person deciding not to fall apart. Gideon went back to thinking. Gideon did not sleep that night. He gave Cassandra his bedroom. The decision took him approximately 3 seconds, the same amount of time it would have taken him to make any other logistical call. And he set himself up on the couch with a blanket that smelled like Maya's fabric softener and his back against the armrest, so he was facing the front door. He left the kitchen light on low. Old habit. He'd never been able to sleep in complete darkness after the 3rd deployment, and he'd long since stopped trying to explain that to himself or fix it. The house settled around him the way old houses do in February, the tick of the baseboard heaters cycling on, the occasional creak from the hallway where the subfloor had a soft spot he kept meaning to repair. He listened to all of it without closing his eyes, and he thought. The drive was the thing. Cassandra had told him, in the careful language of someone who was still calibrating how much to trust a man she'd met 2 hours ago in a parking garage, that the encrypted drive contained documentation she had compiled herself over 3 weeks, transaction records pulled from subsidiary accounts she technically had access to but rarely reviewed, cross-referenced against contractor invoices that didn't match the services they claimed to represent. She had found the discrepancy by accident, she said. A line item in a quarterly report that a junior accountant had flagged as a rounding error, and that Cassandra, on a late night with nothing better to do than read the report. No one expected the CEO to actually read, had followed like a thread until she found where it ended. Where it ended was not a rounding error. How much? Gideon had asked. She had told him. He had kept his face neutral, but the number was not small. It was the kind of number that explained 3 men in a parking garage without any further analysis required. What he turned over now, lying on his couch at 2 in the morning, was the timing problem. Cassandra had said she hadn't told anyone she was going to act on the documentation tonight. She had planned to take the drive to her attorney in the morning. The original was on an encrypted server. This was a physical backup she'd made herself, working alone after her assistant left. She had not mentioned this to her security detail, her executive assistant, her board liaison, or anyone else. And yet, 3 men with the right vehicle description, the right parking level, the right exit ramp, and the specific knowledge that she was carrying the drive. He went through it methodically, the way he used to go through pre-mission intelligence, not looking for the most dramatic answer, looking for the one that fit the most facts. Someone had known she was compiling the documentation. Someone had monitored her movements closely enough to know when she'd made the physical backup. And someone had access to the building's security rotation schedules, because the empty security desk on B1 and the disabled cellular repeater were not coincidences. Those required either access or cooperation. By 3 in the morning, Gideon had arrived at a conclusion that he didn't like. This wasn't an opportunistic crime. This was an operation. Someone inside Bellamy Medical had been running this long enough and carefully enough to have contingency plans. And when Cassandra had started pulling at threads, they had moved to eliminate the problem before it reached daylight. He got up, drank water, stood at the kitchen window, and looked at the empty street. The Escalade was parked 2 blocks over, behind a grocery store. He'd moved it after Cassandra went to bed. It was too visible and too findable. When he came back to the couch, he picked up the drive from the side table where Cassandra had left it before going to bed. She'd handed it to him without much discussion, not because she trusted him completely, he thought, but because she was practical enough to recognize that holding it herself while sleeping alone in a stranger's house wasn't a meaningful security improvement. He turned it over in his hands. Standard encrypted USB, the kind that required a password on a proprietary software interface. He couldn't access the contents, and he hadn't tried to. What he was looking at was the exterior. The wear on the casing, the age of the device, the small manufacturer's label on the bottom that told him something about its origin. This drive had been purchased recently. The label had the kind of newness to it that store packaging leaves on plastics for the first few months, which meant Cassandra had bought it specifically for this purpose, recently. And if someone inside the company had known she was copying files to a physical drive, they had been watching her closely enough to observe a purchase, or they'd been watching her computer activity. Gideon set the drive down and stared at the ceiling. In the morning, he was going to need more information. And there was only one way to get more information about what was happening inside Bellamy Medical. He was going to have to go back inside Bellamy Medical, said. Maya took the situation with the adaptability of a child who had grown up understanding that her father's definition of a normal evening sometimes differed from other people's. She came out of her bedroom at 7, found Cassandra at the kitchen table in the same borrowed sweatshirt, eating toast that she had made herself after apparently spending 20 minutes figuring out where Gideon kept the bread, and simply sat down across from her and resumed the conversation they'd started the previous night as though no time had passed. "Did you sleep okay?" Maya asked. "Better than I expected," Cassandra said, which was honest in a way that surprised even her. "Dad's bed is comfortable, but the pillow smells a little bit like his shampoo, which takes getting used to." "It did, yes." Maya considered this. "He uses the same shampoo as always because he says switching brands is a waste of time when something already works." She said this with the patient tone of someone reporting a minor character flaw they've cataloged but accepted. "He's kind of stubborn about routine." "Is he?" "Yeah, he's been using the same coffee mug for like 4 years. It has a chip in the handle, but he won't get a new one." Maya picked up her toast. "What do you do? Like for work?" Cassandra opened her mouth and then paused, the honest answer working its way through the filter of the previous 12 hours. "I run a company," she said. "A medical technology company. We make equipment that helps doctors diagnose patients more accurately." Maya processed this. "That sounds important." "It is, I hope." "Is that why someone was trying to hurt you?" The directness of it landed without softness, the way children's observations often do. Cassandra looked at the 9-year-old across the table and did not try to reroute the conversation. Yes, she said. That's part of it. Maya nodded slowly. Dad says most bad things that happen to people happen because of money or because someone's scared of getting caught doing something wrong. Your dad is not wrong about that. He's right about most things, Maya said, with the dispassion of someone stating a fact rather than offering a compliment. He just doesn't always know what to do with people. Like, he's really good at fixing problems, but he gets weird about feelings. Cassandra looked down at her coffee to avoid letting the child see her expression. Gideon appeared from the back of the house in his work clothes, the dark green facilities uniform with the Meridian Corporate Plaza patch on the chest, worn and clean. He looked at both of them at the table, read something in the quality of the silence, and chose not to investigate it. I need to go into the building today, he said to Cassandra, pouring coffee without sitting down. Not to the office floors. I have access to the maintenance infrastructure, crawl spaces, utility corridors, server room adjacencies. He paused. The people who set up last night needed someone to disable the repeater and coordinate the security desk rotation. That required building-side access. I want to find out who they used. Cassandra set her mug down. You're going to go back in there. It's my job site. Nobody will question me being there. And if the people from last night, they don't know what I look like in a facilities uniform, he said. They saw a man in a parking garage after 9 at night. That's different from a maintenance supervisor doing his morning rounds. She looked at him for a moment. You've thought through this. I thought through it last night, while you were supposedly sleeping on the couch. I don't sleep much. She didn't push on that. Instead, she looked at the drive on the table between them. I should come with you. No. Gideon, not yet, he said, and the gentleness and the correction surprised them both slightly. He looked at her steadily. The building's security system will have flagged your access card after last night. If you badge in this morning, whoever is watching will know you're there before you reach the elevator. I need an hour in the infrastructure first. Can you stay here with Maya? Maya, who had been eating toast with the focused concentration of someone pretending not to listen, said, I don't have school today. Teacher workday. Cassandra looked at the child, then back at Gideon. Fine, she said. 1 hour. Probably 2. 1.5. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, a slight shift at the corner of his mouth that arrived and left quickly, like something he hadn't fully authorized. 2, he said, and picked up his keys. Meridian Corporate Plaza in the morning was an entirely different organism than Meridian Corporate Plaza at night. The lobby moved with the particular organized chaos of a large commercial building, absorbing its daily population, security badges, beeping, elevator banks cycling, the coffee cart in the lobby corner doing its best work of the day. Gideon walked through it the way he always walked through it, at a maintenance worker's pace, which is slightly slower than a professional's pace and slightly more purposeful than a visitor's, carrying a tablet and a tool bag and the kind of expression that communicates occupied but not busy. Nobody looked at him. This was the thing he had learned in the first month of this job, and that he had never found entirely surprising. In a building full of people who had spent years cultivating the appearance of importance, the man carrying the tool bag was invisible. Not disrespected exactly. People said good morning, held elevator doors, occasionally stopped him to report a flickering light or a bathroom issue, but not seen, not registered as a full person with a history. He had found this useful. He still found it useful. He took the service elevator to the basement and let himself into the utility corridor that ran the spine of the building's infrastructure. Down here, everything was exposed. Conduit bundles, pipe runs, the cable management trays that fed network and power to every floor above. He knew this corridor better than the engineers who had designed it, because they had designed it once and moved on, and he had been maintaining it for 4 years. The cellular repeater for B2 was mounted on a junction panel at the north end of the basement service corridor. Gideon reached it in 6 minutes and stood in front of it with his tablet open, running a diagnostic. The repeater had been manually disabled, not failed, disabled. The maintenance log showed a service access at 6:47 p.m. the previous evening. The credential used was a facilities access card registered to a part-time contractor named Dale Ferris, who worked Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Yesterday was Thursday. Gideon photographed the log with his tablet and moved on. The security desk on B1 was the next stop. Marcus Tran, the regular Thursday evening guard, was at his post when Gideon arrived. looking somewhat uncomfortable, his eyes moving in the way of a person who has rehearsed an explanation and is waiting to be asked for it. Gideon leaned against the desk and made a point of looking at the incident log instead of at Marcus. "Quiet night last night?" he said. Marcus shifted. "Pretty quiet. I was down in B2 late. Didn't see you at the desk around 9. A pause. "Bathroom break." Gideon nodded, very slowly, and kept his eyes on the log. He could feel Marcus's discomfort from 3 feet away. The quality of it, the specific flavor of shame that was different from guilt. More like embarrassment at having done something that felt reasonable in the moment and looked different in retrospect. "You know what's strange," Gideon said conversationally, "is that the repeater in B2 got accessed last night by a Friday contractor's card, on a Thursday." He looked up. "You see anything like that logged on the desk system here?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "Marcus," Gideon said, quieter, "I'm not building a case against you. I'm trying to understand what happened last night so it doesn't happen again to someone who might not be as lucky as Ms. Bellamy." The guard looked at his desk. He was maybe 24, 25, young enough that whatever he'd been offered or told last night had seemed manageable, and old enough that this morning it wasn't sitting right. "Guy came down around 6:30, Marcus said, finally, still looking at the desk. "Said he was from building management, had a badge. Said there was going to be a private security walkthrough of B2 for one of the executive tenants, and I should take my break between 9 and 9:30, so I wasn't in the way." He paused. It sounded real. The badge looked right. "What did the guy look like?" Marcus described him. Average height, dark jacket, forgettable face. It matched none of the 3 men from the garage, which told Gideon that whoever had organized this had used a separate layer of coordination, someone to handle the inside access, while others handled the outside execution. That was operational thinking. That wasn't improvised. "Did you get his name?" Gideon asked. He said Hartwell, from building management. There was no one named Hartwell in building management. Gideon had worked alongside every member of the facilities and management team for 4 years. He straightened up. "Okay," he said. "Thanks, Marcus." "Am I—" Marcus stopped. Tried again. "Is this going to be a problem for me?" Gideon looked at him for a moment. "Did you know what they were actually going to do down there?" "No, I swear I didn't." "Then cooperate honestly if anyone official asks you about it. That's the best thing you can do right now." He picked up his tablet. "You did something dumb because someone made it sound like a reasonable thing to do. That's different from what they did." He left Marcus with that and walked back toward the service elevator. 2 layers of inside access. A contractor credential and a security desk manipulation. Both had been set up specifically for last night, which meant someone had planned last night in advance. Not for weeks necessarily, but for long enough to prepare. Long enough to monitor Cassandra's movements, identify the night she'd moved the drive, and put the pieces in place. On the elevator going back up, Gideon thought about who inside Bellamy Medical had both the organizational access to monitor Cassandra's schedule and the external connections to arrange 3 men in a black sedan. He didn't know the company well enough to answer that yet, but he knew someone who did. I was back at Aldermore Street by 10:40. Cassandra was at the kitchen table with Maya's colored pencils, which she had apparently been using to create a chart of some kind on the back of Maya's homework paper. Columns of numbers and names that she had reconstructed from memory, because her laptop was at the office, and she was the kind of person whose memory for financial detail was precise enough to be a functional substitute. Maya was on the couch reading, casting occasional evaluating looks at the adult who had taken over her art supplies without asking and seemed to feel entitled to do so. Gideon pulled out the chair across from Cassandra and sat down. He put his tablet on the table between them. "Contractor credential was used to disable the B2 repeater at 6:47 last night," he said. "The credential belongs to a part-time worker who wasn't scheduled. The security guard on B1 was told to take a break at 9 by a man with a fake building management badge." Cassandra looked at the tablet, then at him. "They planned this." "Yes." "How far in advance?" "Far enough to get a contractor credential, either stolen or borrowed. That takes at least a few days to arrange if you know what you're doing." She sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and Gideon watched her work through it. The same arithmetic he'd been doing since 2 in the morning, arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion from a different starting point. "Warren," she said. Gideon waited. Warren Slade, she said. My COO. He's been with me since the second year of the company. He handles operational logistics, vendor contracts, facility management, security oversight. She paused. He has access to all of it. Building management, security rotation scheduling, contractor databases. He would know your calendar. He would know my calendar better than I do most days. Her voice was level, but there was something working beneath it. The specific kind of anger that comes from betrayal, which is different from ordinary anger because it has to pass through a layer of disbelief first. He also handles the subsidiary accounts, the contractor invoices. Gideon nodded. The accounts where you found the discrepancies. She looked at the chart she'd been drawing. I found them in his operational budget line. I thought it was an accounting error. I thought... She stopped, picked up a pencil, put it down. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation. I spent 3 weeks finding a reasonable explanation. And when you couldn't find one? I made the drive. She looked at him. I made it on Tuesday evening, after everyone had left. I used my own laptop, my own credentials. No one should have known. Your computer activity is monitored? Standard corporate IT security. I approved it. I never thought about the fact that... She stopped again. That someone at the executive level would have access to the monitoring logs. Gideon said, Warren Slade would. Yes, she said. Warren Slade would. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. From the couch, Maya turned a page. Can you prove it? Gideon asked. With what's on the drive, I can prove the fraud. Whether I can prove Warren specifically ordered what happened last night. She shook her head slightly. Not yet. Not from outside the building. He looked at her chart. The columns of numbers were precise and organized, recalled from memory with the confidence of someone who trusted her own mind. He had seen that quality in certain people. The ones who were genuinely formidable rather than just successfully positioned. You need to get back into the building, he said. Yes. And you need to get to the board meeting. She looked up sharply. How do you know about the board meeting? I work in the building. I hear things. A beat. When is it? Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. If I'm not in that room with the evidence, Warren controls the meeting. She paused. He's been positioning himself for weeks. Small things, shifting reporting structures, relocating personnel, building consensus with board members who don't know him well enough to read what he's actually doing. If he gets control of that room before I walk in with the evidence, he locks you out, Gideon said. He does more than lock me out. He uses the meeting to move a vote of no confidence. With the right framing, and Warren is very good at framing, he can make the fraud look like mine before I can say a word. She said this without self-pity, just assessment. The voice of someone who understood the mechanics of how she could be destroyed. He's been building toward it. I can see it now. I couldn't see it 2 weeks ago. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He thought about the building. He thought about the executive floors, 14 through 19, and the maintenance access points he knew and the ones he didn't. He thought about Warren Slade's office, which he had been inside exactly once, to repair a thermostat, and which had 2 windows and 1 door and a private adjoining conference space that connected to the main corridor through a secondary hallway. He thought about the service infrastructure, the utility corridors, the access points that existed in every commercial building, and that existed in a specific sense for him. I can get you into the building without badging through the main entrance, he said. Service access through the basement. My credentials, my routes, he paused. But I can't get you to the executive floors without someone seeing you. Those floors have additional keycard checkpoints. I have my access card, which is flagged. I have a secondary access card, she said. Emergency access, kept in a separate system. It's supposed to be for genuine emergencies, building lockdowns, evacuation scenarios. Warren doesn't know about it. I set it up independently through a separate security vendor 18 months ago. She looked slightly embarrassed. I've always believed in redundancy. That, Gideon said, is a useful habit. She almost smiled. It was brief and tired and not entirely happy, but it was real. Can you get me to the building tomorrow morning without being seen? She asked. I can try. He paused. There's something else we need to do before tomorrow. What? I need to understand the layout of the executive floor, specifically what Warren's access looks like. How he'd move if he knew you were in the building. What doors he can lock. What systems he controls. Where he'd go. He looked at her. You know his habits better than anyone. She leaned forward, pulled the chart toward her, and flipped it over to the blank side. She picked up the pencil. Give me 20 minutes, she said. One. They worked at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Cassandra drew from memory, not just Warren's office configuration, but the whole executive floor, the security checkpoints, the camera placements she remembered from the installation memo 3 years ago, the access hierarchy for the building's security systems. She spoke as she drew, and Gideon listened and occasionally asked questions that made her look at him differently each time he asked them. Not questions about the business, questions about sight lines, about choke points, about which corridors had foot traffic at which times and which ones were quiet. At one point, Maya came to the table to get a glass of water and looked at the map Cassandra was drawing. That looks like the building where Dad works, Maya said. It is, Cassandra said. Maya studied it for a moment. You put the bathrooms in the wrong place. On the 14th floor, they're on the east side, not the west. She pointed. Dad had to fix a pipe up there last year, and he took me with him one weekend when the building was empty, I remember. Cassandra looked at Gideon. He shrugged with one shoulder. She pays attention. Cassandra corrected the drawing. Maya got her water and went back to the couch. By noon, the map was as complete as memory could make it. Gideon folded it and put it in his breast pocket. He looked at what they had and thought about what it meant. Warren Slade, if he knew Cassandra was still in play, would move quickly. He would assume last night had failed, but he wouldn't know why. He wouldn't know about Gideon specifically. He'd know a variable had intervened, but not what kind of variable. He would assume Cassandra was afraid and off balance and without allies. He would not expect her to walk into that boardroom at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning with the evidence intact and a man who knew every maintenance corridor in the building walking beside her. That was the advantage. It was not a large advantage, but Gideon had worked with smaller ones before. You should eat something, he said to Cassandra. Real food, not toast. She looked at him. You're worried about what I eat. I'm worried about you being functional tomorrow. Food is part of that. She was quiet for a moment. You do this, the practical logistics of taking care of people, very naturally. I have a 9-year-old, he said. You stop having the option to be unpractical. She looked at her hands on the table. The nail polish, he noticed for the first time, was chipped on 2 fingers, evidence of 3 weeks of late nights and the kind of stress that gets into the small details of a person's maintenance. She's a remarkable kid, Cassandra said. Maya. I know. She's not afraid of anything. She is, Gideon said. She's just learned that being afraid doesn't change most things, so she doesn't lead with it. He paused. She learned that from her mother. It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife. The mention sat in the air briefly, and Cassandra had the good sense not to pull at it. I'll make soup, he said, standing. There's enough for 3. She didn't argue. At the stove, with his back to the table, Gideon let himself think about tomorrow, with the honest part of his brain. The part that didn't package things for other people's consumption. What he was proposing to do was not small. Getting Cassandra into the building undetected, navigating her to the executive floor through service corridors, keeping Warren's people away from her long enough for her to reach the boardroom and connect that drive. Any number of things could go wrong. Warren could have additional inside assets he didn't know about. The security system could have been further compromised. He would be working in a building he maintained rather than in an environment he had trained for, against opponents whose number and capability he didn't fully know, with a civilian who he had met less than 18 hours ago. He chopped onion. He thought about Maya, asleep tonight without knowing what was happening. He thought about the life he had built here, the maintenance job, the old truck, the 2 boards on the porch that needed replacing, the 4 years of careful, ordinary days. He thought about the cable that had been deliberately disconnected in that garage. Someone had planned to make a woman disappear, or at minimum to silence her, using the building he worked in, using infrastructure he maintained. In a certain way that he couldn't entirely articulate and didn't try to, this was also about that. The soup will take about 40 minutes, he said without turning around. Okay, Cassandra said. After dinner, get some sleep. Tomorrow starts early. A pause from the table. Then, Gideon. He looked over his shoulder. She met his eyes with the directness of someone who had decided to stop managing how she appeared. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. You could have fixed the cable, called the police, and walked away. Nobody would have blamed you. He turned back to the stove. He considered the question honestly, the way it deserved. The police would have taken a report, he said, and Warren Slade has enough inside access to know a report was filed before the ink dried. And you'd have spent last night in a hotel room alone with a drive full of evidence and no idea who to trust. He stirred the soup base. I've seen what happens when the wrong person wins because no one with any capability decided it was their problem. He paused. I didn't like what I saw. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. That's not a complete answer, Cassandra said. He almost smiled at his reflection in the kitchen window. No, he said, it's not. He didn't give her the rest of it. Not yet, because the rest of it was simpler and more awkward and had to do with the fact that when he had seen her standing in that garage, alone, phone dead, car disabled, maintaining her composure against the particular fear of a woman who knows she is in danger and does not yet know how much, something in him had recognized that composure as the kind that costs people a great deal to maintain, and he had found it very difficult to walk past. He'd spent 4 years walking past things. He stirred the soup and did not say that. Maya came into the kitchen 20 minutes later and informed them both that she wanted to help. And Gideon gave her bread to slice, and Cassandra, without being asked, set the table for 3. And for a while the house on Aldermore Street was just a house with people in it who needed to eat before tomorrow came. They left the house on Aldermore Street at 6:15 in the morning. The city was still dark at that hour, the kind of dark that February makes specific. Not the clean dark of midnight, but the gray-purple pre-dawn that arrives already tired. The sky the color of old concrete, the street lamps still burning orange against it. Gideon's breath clouded in the air as he locked the front door. Cassandra stood on the porch in a change of clothes she'd needed. A pair of Maya's oversized sweatpants that were 3 inches too short, and a coat Gideon had found in the hall closet, a woman's coat, dark green, that had been there for 4 years and that neither of them commented on. Maya had been awake when they left. Gideon had told her the night before that he would need to leave early, and she had accepted this with the tired resignation of a child accustomed to her father's schedule-making demands. But when he came to her doorway at 6 to check on her, she was sitting up in bed with the lamp on, reading. "You don't have to wait up," he said. "I wasn't waiting up. I just woke up early." A pause. "Are you going to be okay?" "Yes." She studied him the way she sometimes did, not with the open worry of a younger child, but with something more contained, more considered. "Is Cassandra going to be okay?" "That's what I'm going to make sure of." Maya looked at her book, then back at him. "She doesn't have anyone," she said, "like, to call. I noticed she never talked about anyone. No family. No friends she mentioned." She paused. "That seems lonelier than losing someone, because at least when you lose someone, it means they were there." Gideon stood in the doorway and did not have an immediate answer for that, because it was the kind of observation that arrived already complete and didn't need a response so much as a moment of acknowledgement. "Go back to sleep," he said. "Mrs. Patterson next door has a key. I'll call when I can." Okay, Maya said, and turned back to her book in the way of someone who would not actually go back to sleep but understood that pretending to try was what the situation called for. He stood in the doorway 1 second longer than he needed to. Then he went to get Cassandra. The drive to Meridian Corporate Plaza took 11 minutes through empty streets. Gideon had borrowed a neighbor's older Honda sedan the previous afternoon, a brief and slightly awkward conversation with Ray Kowalski from 3 houses down that had involved minimal explanation and maximum reliance on 4 years of being a decent neighbor. The Escalade remained behind the grocery store. Using it would be foolish, and they could not afford foolish today. Cassandra sat in the passenger seat with the encrypted drive in her blazer pocket. She'd retrieved her blazer from the bedroom, the charcoal one, wrinkled now but still carrying the authority of good fabric, and the map she and Gideon had worked on the previous afternoon folded in her other pocket. She had her secondary access card in her shoe, which she had decided on herself, and which Gideon had noted without comment. "When we get inside," he said, "you don't talk unless necessary. If someone sees us in the service corridors, you're a city building inspector I'm escorting through a facilities review. Your name is Linda Park. You've done this once before and you know to let me lead." "Linda Park," she repeated. "You picked that name yourself just now if anyone asks." "Understood." She looked straight ahead at the dark street. What if Warren's already moved? What if he's put people on the service access points? Then we adapt. He paused. Has he ever shown operational intelligence? Planning, logistics, contingency thinking? She considered this. He's organized. He's thorough. He anticipates problems in advance and prepares responses. A beat. But he thinks in corporate systems. Hierarchies, access credentials, official channels. He's never had to improvise in physical space. That's useful. Is it enough? Gideon didn't answer immediately. He turned the Honda onto the service road that ran along the east side of the plaza, a road used by delivery trucks and maintenance vehicles that most office workers didn't know existed. I've been in situations with worse odds, he said finally, and worse preparation. She looked at him. In the early light coming through the windshield, she could see the particular quality in his face that she had first noticed in the parking garage, and that she had been trying to name ever since. The stillness of a man whose relationship with danger was not one of ignorance, not bravado, not the performance of calm, the actual thing. How bad? She asked. Bad enough that I don't talk about it. She turned back to the road. Okay, she said. They parked the Honda in the service bay on the east side, between a facilities truck and a catering delivery van, where it would read as belonging. Gideon had his tool bag. He had dressed in his full maintenance uniform, the tablet clipped to his belt, his building credentials visible on the lanyard at his chest. He looked exactly like what he had been every working day for 4 years. Cassandra walked half a step behind him and slightly to his left, the way people walk when they are following someone through a building they don't control. And she did this naturally without being told because she was, whatever else could be said about her, intelligent enough to know when to let someone else lead. The service entrance required a key card and a 5-digit code. Gideon keyed in both without hesitating and held the door. The utility corridor beyond smelled of concrete and machine oil and the particular institutional air of spaces no one has opened a window in for years. They went in. The service corridor ran north-south along the building's spine and accessed every mechanical floor via locked doors that Gideon's master facilities credential would open. He had mapped their route the night before, lying on the couch long after midnight, working it through his memory of every space he'd been in over 4 years. The utility shaft that accessed a crawlspace above the 13th floor ceiling. The crawlspace that had an emergency access hatch into the 14th floor's service closet. The service closet that opened, if you knew how to work the lock from the inside, into the main corridor of the 14th floor, 30 feet from the executive elevator bank. It was not a comfortable route. The crawlspace was exactly wide enough for a person to move through on hands and knees if that person didn't mind concrete dust and the occasional electrical conduit at head height. But it bypassed every badge checkpoint on the executive floors, and Warren Slade had never in his professional life needed to think about what was above the ceiling tiles. They reached the utility shaft access point on the mechanical floor below 14 in 9 minutes. Gideon unlocked the access panel and looked inside. The shaft was dark and close, a ladder bolted to the wall rising 8 feet to the crawlspace hatch above. "This is the part," he said quietly, "where I have to tell you it's not comfortable." Cassandra looked up into the shaft without expression. "How long?" 60 feet of crawl space, maybe. 10 minutes if we move steadily." She was silent for a moment, then she pulled her blazer straight, as though adjusting for a meeting, and stepped to the ladder. "I'll manage," she said. She managed. She was not graceful about it. Nobody was graceful in a crawl space with 3 inches of clearance above their head. But she moved without complaint and without stopping, which was the thing that mattered. Gideon went first, paused at junctions to check direction by the emergency markers he'd placed himself during a routine inspection 2 years ago. Small pieces of reflective tape that nobody else would notice or interpret correctly. At one point, she knocked her elbow against a conduit bracket and made a sharp sound through her teeth. He paused. "Keep going," she said from behind him, before he could ask. He kept going. The emergency access hatch into the 14th floor service closet was stiff. The hinges hadn't been used in at least a year, and for a moment it didn't move when he pushed, and he felt the specific cold of a plan's critical point resisting. Then he shifted his angle, applied pressure closer to the frame rather than the center, and it swung open with a sound like a large book being closed. They dropped into the service closet. Gideon eased the hatch back into position. The closet smelled of cleaning products and cardboard, A sliver of light came under the door from the corridor beyond. He listened at the door for 15 seconds. Voices in the distance, the normal morning traffic of people arriving, coffee cups, footwear on carpet. Nothing that sounded coordinated or watchful. He looked at Cassandra. She was pulling concrete dust from her blazer sleeve with 2 fingers. There was a smear of something gray along her left cheekbone. She didn't know it was there. "You have something," he started. She wiped her face without asking where, accurately, with the back of her hand. "Gone?" "Mostly." "Close enough," she said. "How do we get to the executive elevator?" he told her. 30 feet north along this corridor, turn left at the second intersection. The executive elevator bank was visible from there. The door to the executive floor, 19, would require her secondary access card. From the elevator to the boardroom was another 40 feet, and the boardroom itself was at the end of a corridor that had one approach from the main floor and a secondary approach through the adjoining conference space that Warren's office connected to. That secondary approach was what worried him. They reached the executive elevator without being stopped. The morning shift was arriving, but the 14th floor, which housed mid-level management rather than executive staff, was occupied by people focused on their own commute rituals, and Gideon moved with the confident purposefulness of a man who belonged everywhere in this building, which after 4 years was not a performance. 2 people said good morning to him by name. He returned it without breaking stride. In the elevator, Cassandra used the secondary access card. The panel accepted it. The 19th floor button lit up. She let out a breath that was not entirely steady. "Once we're on 19, Gideon said quietly, watching the floor indicator. "How long do you need to get the drive connected and the evidence up before the meeting starts?" She looked at the time on her watch. 8:42. The board meeting was at 10. The boardroom AV system has a direct input at the head of the table. 2 minutes to connect, another 2 to unlock the drive with my credentials and cue the documentation. She paused. "The problem is that Warren will know I'm there the moment I badge onto the floor. The secondary card isn't invisible. It just uses a different system. It'll show on the security dashboard eventually." "How long before it flags?" "I don't know. It was never designed to be covert. 10 minutes, maybe. Maybe less if Warren has someone actively monitoring." The elevator reached 19. The doors opened. The executive floor of Bellamy Medical was quieter than the floors below. Better carpet, lower ceilings, the particular hush of a space that had been designed to feel important. Cassandra moved out of the elevator first, and Gideon came behind her, and for the first 30 seconds, nothing happened, and he thought perhaps they had more time than he'd calculated. Then the door at the far end of the corridor opened. It was not Warren. It was 2 men in the dark jackets of private security contractors, not the building security team, not faces Gideon recognized. And they moved with the specific purposefulness of people who have been told to watch for something and have just seen it. "Ms. Bellamy," the closer one said. His hand went to his radio. "Don't," Gideon said. It was one word. The way he said it had nothing to do with volume, something in the register of it. The total absence of negotiation, the quality of a man who has already calculated what comes next, made the man's hand pause just long enough. "Those are private security contractors," Cassandra said quietly, from just behind Gideon's shoulder. "Not building security. Warren brought them in." "When?" "This morning, probably. Last night at the earliest. He's been planning for the possibility I'd survive." The 2 men had spread slightly, the way people do when they're deciding whether to move or wait for a signal. The one who'd reached for his radio was still deciding. The second was watching Gideon with the careful attention of a person recalibrating his initial assessment. Gideon took stock of the corridor. 40 feet to the boardroom entrance. The secondary approach through Warren's conference space was to the right, down a short hall. There was a fire door 20 feet behind them that led to the stairwell. The 2 contractors were 15 feet ahead. "Walk to the boardroom," he said to Cassandra, low and level. "Straight line, don't stop." "They'll intercept." "I know," he said. "Walk." She walked. The contractor on the left moved to stop her, and Gideon moved first. Not to fight, but to occupy the man's attention and space entirely, putting himself into the contractor's path so that the choice became deal with Gideon or go through Gideon, and neither of those options was fast. The man grabbed his arm. Gideon let him hold it, the grab itself wasn't the threat, and used the held position to pivot the man's weight sideways, not violently, just enough that he lost his angle on Cassandra by 2 crucial steps. The second contractor came in. This one was more purposeful, and Gideon had a fraction of a second to decide between 2 options and chose the one that kept him on his feet and the corridor open. He took the contact on his left side rather than letting it spin him, absorbed it into a controlled backward step, and used the wall to arrest his movement and bounce back into a position that put him between both men and the boardroom door. It was not elegant. His shoulder was going to complain tomorrow. But Cassandra had gained the 8 feet she needed. The contractor with the radio got it to his mouth. Security to 19, executive corridor. Gideon got a hand on the radio, not violently but decisively, and there was a brief contest over it that he won on leverage rather than strength. The radio clattered to the floor. He stepped back. "We're going to the boardroom," he said to both of them. "You can call whatever you want to call, but she has a legal right to be in that building, and you are contracted private personnel with no authority to detain an executive of this company." He said this clearly and without hurry, because the goal right now was not victory, it was delay. 60 more seconds, 90, enough for Cassandra to reach the boardroom and put that drive in the system before Warren could intervene. One of the contractors looked at the other. That look was the small negotiation of men who have been hired for a job and are now calculating whether the job has crossed into territory their contract covers. Gideon had seen that look before, in different contexts, with higher stakes. The look always meant the same thing, hesitation. He used it. "Go," he said over his shoulder. Cassandra was at the boardroom door. He heard the other door open before he saw who came through it. Warren Slade was 52 years old, with the well-maintained build of a man who ran 5 miles every morning, because it was on the schedule, and the schedule was what Warren Slade lived by. He wore a charcoal suit that was better than Gideon's entire wardrobe, and his expression when he came through the conference space door and into the executive corridor was the expression of a man who had just learned that something he had spent considerable effort neutralizing had refused to be neutralized. He saw Cassandra at the boardroom door. He saw the drive in her hand, and then he saw Gideon. Warren's eyes moved over Gideon in the way that eyes move over a person when they are trying to place him, and then a slightly different version of that when placing him raised more questions than it answered. The maintenance uniform, the tool bag, the face of a man who had been working in this building for 4 years and whose name Warren Slade had never once needed to know. "Who the hell are you?" Warren said. "Facilities," Gideon said. "I was escorting a building inspector." The contempt that moved across Warren's face was reflexive, the automatic response of a man for whom maintenance workers occupied a specific and low rung. "Get him out of here," he said to the contractors. Cassandra's voice came from the boardroom doorway. "Warren," her voice was even, "step back." Warren looked at her. Something moved through his features. Not guilt, Gideon thought, but the particular anger of someone who has planned carefully and watched the plan come apart in the final stretch. "Cassandra, this isn't—" "I'm going into this boardroom," she said. "The board convenes in 70 minutes, and you're going to stand there in this corridor and think very carefully about what you do next, because everything you've done for the last 18 months is on this drive, and I am about to connect it to the AV system in front of 12 board members." She paused. "Or you can try to stop me. But you should know that whatever happens in the next 5 minutes is being recorded by this building's security cameras, and I have every legal right to be standing here." Warren's jaw worked. He looked at the contractors. He looked at Gideon. He looked at the boardroom door. "She's not authorized to—" he started. "I'm the CEO," Cassandra said. "I'm always authorized." She went through the door. Warren took 2 steps toward the boardroom, and Gideon simply moved into the corridor between them. He didn't threaten. He didn't touch Warren. He just stood there, between a man who outweighed him in every category this building recognized as mattering, and a door. Warren stopped. He stared at Gideon with something that was working itself up toward contempt, but kept landing short of it, because contempt requires confidence, and something about the way Gideon was standing, perfectly still, without aggression, without apparent concern, was making the confidence difficult to sustain. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into," Warren said. "Probably not," Gideon agreed. "But I know what I've gotten you out of. The corridor." He looked at the man. "Stay there." One of the contractors made a decision then, stepping forward, hand going to Gideon's shoulder. What happened next was brief and not complicated. Gideon moved in a way that used the contractor's own momentum to put him into the wall sideways, firmly enough to register but not to injure. The contractor ended up facing the wall with one arm pinned, breathing through his nose. The second contractor stopped moving. Warren stared. The contractor from the previous year, a man named Dietrich, who had done private security work for 6 years across 3 different firms, and who had met, in those 6 years, exactly the kind of men he thought he could read, looked at Gideon Rourke in a facilities uniform holding his colleague against the wall, and something in his expression changed. "Rourke," he said, slowly. The way a person says a name when they're not entirely sure of it, but fairly sure. "Gideon Rourke." Gideon released the contractor, took a step back. "You were in third group," Dietrich said. Not a question. "Before Dev grew. My old team lead served with you in Kandahar. He talked about a guy named Rourke." He paused. "Said the quietest guys in any unit were always the ones you really didn't want to corner." Gideon said nothing. Dietrich looked at his colleague, who was pressing his shoulder against the wall and breathing more steadily now. Then he looked at Warren Slade. Something in his face had rearranged itself into the expression of a man renegotiating the terms of a job he'd taken without complete information. "Mr. Slade," Dietrich said, "I think my contract has reached its scope boundary." Warren turned to him with the look of a man whose world was reducing by increments. "You can't—" "We're not cleared for this," Dietrich said simply. "And I'm not going to put hands on a former special operations guy because a COO told me to detain an executive in her own building." He stepped back. "Call your lawyers. That's what lawyers are for." Warren Slade stood in the corridor of the company he had spent 18 months trying to take and looked at the maintenance worker between him and the boardroom door and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "This isn't done." "It is for today," Gideon said. Inside the boardroom, behind the closed door, Cassandra Bellamy was connecting a drive to a system that was about to tell 12 board members exactly what had been happening to their company. Warren knew it. Gideon could see him knowing it, the particular expression of a plan's final failure, which is different from ordinary defeat because it arrives after so much careful construction, and the distance between where you thought you were and where you actually are is so much longer to fall. Warren turned and walked back through the conference space door. Gideon stood in the corridor and let him go. Not because Warren wasn't a threat. He was still a threat, and would be until the proper authorities were involved. But because the boardroom was the priority, and Cassandra was in it, and for the next 70 minutes the corridor needed to stay clear. He sat down in one of the hallway chairs meant for people waiting for executive meetings, and put his tool bag beside him, and his forearms on his knees, and watched the corridor. The 2 contractors left without further conversation. Dietrich paused at the elevator and looked back at Gideon. "For what it's worth," he said, "I didn't know what the job actually was. Guy said it was a corporate security situation, internal personnel issue." "I know," Gideon said. It was true. The distinction between willing participation and manipulation mattered, and the contractor's behavior in the corridor suggested the latter. Dietrich nodded once. Then the elevator took him. The corridor was quiet. Gideon sat with the quiet and the tool bag, and the particular mix of things running through him that he had no comfortable name for and hadn't for years. The post-operational clarity, the sharpness of the last 30 minutes, already beginning to resolve into something flatter, the way the body comes down from heightened states as though someone is slowly turning down a dial. His shoulder hurt where he'd taken the contact. His right knee was complaining about the crawl space. He was aware, in the way that always arrived after, and never during, of everything that could have gone differently. The second contractor making a different call. Warren having moved faster. The secondary access card not working. Cassandra hesitating at the boardroom door instead of going through it. None of those things had happened. But they could have. And the awareness of the gap between what had happened and what could have was the thing he'd never been able to explain to people who hadn't lived in that gap professionally. He thought about Maya, at home with Mrs. Patterson next door. He would call her in a few minutes. He would say it was fine, and she would not fully believe him, and would ask 2 follow-up questions that would tell her what she actually needed to know, and then she would say, "Okay," and go back to her book. He sat in the hallway chair and watched the elevator and the conference space door and the stairwell door, and said nothing to anyone for 40 minutes. At 9:40, the boardroom door opened and Cassandra looked out. She saw him in the chair. Her expression did something complicated and brief. "It's working," she said. "The documentation is queued. The board members are starting to arrive." "Warren?" "He's not answering his phone. His assistant says he left the building 20 minutes ago." Gideon nodded. Running was a particular kind of answer. It would look the way it looked. "Where are you with what you need?" "I have everything I need for the meeting. I have legal on the phone. They're coming in now." She paused in the doorway, holding the door with one hand, and looked at him in the hallway chair with the tool bag and the maintenance uniform and the 4 years of invisible mornings that had somehow arrived here. "You should come in." "No," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "The board would want to—" "I work in the building," he said simply. "That's all I am today. The rest is yours." He paused. "Go run your meeting, Ms. Bellamy." Something moved through her face that she didn't try to stop or manage. She stood there another second, holding the door. "Cassandra," she said. He looked up at her. "After everything in the last 24 hours, she said, "I think you can call me Cassandra." He held the eye contact for a moment, then looked back at the corridor. "Go run your meeting, Cassandra," he said. She went. He heard the boardroom door click shut behind her, and then the murmur of voices beyond it, professional voices, serious voices, the sound of a company facing what its own negligence had let grow inside it. And above all of that, clear and steady, the particular voice of a woman who had spent a night in a maintenance worker's house wearing a child's sweatshirt and had come out the other side of it knowing exactly who she was and exactly what she was going to say. He stayed in the hallway chair. At 9:58, through the boardroom door, he heard the meeting called to order. At 10:03, he heard the first screen activate, the sharp triple tone of a presentation system coming to life, and then a silence in the room that was the silence of people seeing something they were not prepared for. Outside the building, somewhere in the city, Warren Slade was making phone calls that were getting harder to make with every minute that passed. Gideon picked up his tool bag. He had a drainage grate on B3 that needed checking. He had the board on the porch that needed replacing. He had a 9-year-old daughter who had been awake since 6 in the morning pretending to read. He walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The floor number above the elevator counted down, and he watched it with the same steady attention he'd been giving everything since last night. Not with anxiety, not with relief. Just with the particular presence of a man who had learned, at considerable cost, that the moments that matter most are usually the ones you don't see coming. He pressed the lobby button. The elevator moved. Warren Slade was arrested on a Thursday. It was 3 weeks after the board meeting. 3 weeks of federal investigators, forensic accountants, and attorneys moving through Bellamy Medical's financial records with the systematic patience of people who are paid to find things that other people have spent considerable effort hiding. They found everything. The shell contractors, the diverted funds routed through 4 layers of subsidiary accounts, the internal communications between Warren and 2 board members he had recruited to his side over 18 months of careful cultivation. They found the arrangement with the private security firm, a firm operating at the edge of its licensing, willing to take assignments that more reputable organizations wouldn't touch. And they found the specific chain of instruction that connected Warren Slade to the 3 men in the black sedan on a Thursday night in a parking garage. The arrest happened at 7 in the morning, at the apartment Warren had moved into after his wife had left him 18 months ago, which was, the investigators noted in their documentation, approximately the same time he had begun diverting company funds. Whether those 2 facts were connected was a matter for someone else to determine. The investigators noted it and moved on. Cassandra heard about it from her legal counsel at 7:22, while she was sitting in her office on the 19th floor drinking coffee that had gone cold because she'd been on calls since 5:30. She listened to the confirmation, said thank you, and set her phone on her desk. She sat there for a moment with the cold coffee and the gray morning pressing against the floor-to-ceiling windows and thought about how much she had expected to feel at this news and how much she actually felt, and the distance between those 2 things. Relief was part of it, but relief was thin, the way that the end of a long tension often produces something flatter than you'd hoped, because the tension had become so woven into daily life that removing it left a shape behind, an outline, and the question of what went inside the outline was one that relief alone couldn't answer. She thought about sitting in Gideon Rourke's kitchen in Maya's sweatshirt while a 9-year-old lent her colored pencils. She thought about the hallway chair, Then she picked up her phone and called her legal counsel back with 3 follow-up questions, because that was what she did, and the morning had 12 more hours in it. The weeks between the board meeting and Warren's arrest had been what Cassandra would later describe, to the one person she eventually trusted enough to describe them to, as the most clarifying period of her professional life, and not in a way that was comfortable. The board meeting itself had gone the way. Evidence tends to go when it is clear and comprehensive and presented by the person who compiled it. There were questions, there was shock, genuine and performed in roughly equal measure. There was a 40-minute recess during which several board members called their personal attorneys. Warren's 2 allies on the board had gone very quiet, in the specific way of people who are calculating how exposed they are and how much distance they can create in the shortest possible time. Cassandra had answered every question. She had been thorough and she had been honest, including about the fact that she had not moved on the evidence sooner because she had been hoping for an innocent explanation, because Warren Slade had been with her company since nearly the beginning, because she had trusted him, and because trust, it turned out, is a thing people in positions like hers are often systematically discouraged from examining too closely. The board had voted unanimously to retain her as CEO. This was not a foregone conclusion, and she had known it wasn't, and she had prepared for the possibility that it wouldn't happen that way. The unanimous nature of the vote had surprised her. One of the older board members, a woman named Frances Delacroix, who had served on 3 other corporate boards, and who Cassandra had always found opaque, had said afterward, "You came in with the evidence yourself. That's not nothing." It was not the most effusive endorsement of her career. It was one of the most meaningful. In the weeks that followed, as the investigators moved through the company and the attorneys managed the public disclosure process, and the communications team did what communications teams do in these situations, Cassandra worked. She worked the way she always worked: long hours, complete attention, the same coffee at her desk routine that had defined her professional life for 9 years. But something was different in how she worked, and she was aware of it without being entirely able to name it. She was paying attention to different things. She was looking at the people around her, not evaluating them for efficiency or alignment with company objectives or the 100 other metrics she'd been trained to apply, but actually looking at them. The junior analyst who came in 45 minutes early every day and left 45 minutes late and never mentioned it. The operations director who had worked directly under Warren and who was now navigating the investigation with the anxious transparency of someone with nothing to hide who was terrified of looking like they did. The receptionist who had, the morning after the board meeting, left a small plant on Cassandra's desk with a note that said simply, "Glad you're still here." She had kept the plant. This was not something she would have done 6 months ago. She wasn't sure she could have explained why she kept it now, except that it seemed important not to. She had also, in those 3 weeks, made 2 calls to a house on Aldermore Street. The first call was the day after the board meeting. Practical, professional, the call of someone tying off a loose end. She had called to let Gideon know that the board had voted to retain her, that legal proceedings were underway, that the building's security situation was being reviewed and remediated, and that she was returning the coat she'd borrowed. Gideon had said, "Good." And then, "The coat's fine, keep it if you need it." She had said she didn't need it. He had said, "Okay." There had been a pause, and then Maya's voice had been audible in the background asking something about dinner, and Gideon had said one moment and then come back to the phone and said he needed to go. Cassandra had said, of course. She had sat with her phone in her hand afterward for longer than she'd sat with most things in her recent professional life. The second call was a week later. This one, she had told herself, was also practical. She wanted to let him know that the investigation had identified the contractor whose credential had been used to access the cellular repeater, a detail she thought he'd want confirmed. This was true. It was also not the only reason she called. Gideon had listened to the update. He'd asked 2 specific questions about the contractor and whether the man had been cooperative with investigators. She told him yes. He said, "Good." There was a pause. "How are you doing?" he asked. The question was simple. It was not elaborate, and it was not deployed with any particular warmth beyond the ordinary kind, and yet it was the question that she had been answering in various professional formulations for 3 weeks: fine, managing, moving forward, focused. And when she opened her mouth to answer it, she found that the professional formulation wasn't coming. "I'm not sure," she said, which was the most honest thing she'd said to another person in 3 weeks. Gideon was quiet for a moment. That makes sense, he said. You've been running on the emergency version of yourself for a while. When things slow down, it's disorienting. She had thought about this for the rest of the day. Well, 3 days after Warren's arrest, Cassandra Bellamy drove to Aldermore Street on a Saturday afternoon, unannounced, carrying a bag from a bakery that Maya had mentioned in passing during their last conversation, a place called Linden's on the north side that did a particular kind of apple pastry that Maya had described with the specific reverence children reserve for food they consider transcendent. She had found the bakery herself. She had not sent an assistant. Gideon opened the door in jeans and a flannel shirt, a dish towel over one shoulder, and looked at her with the expression of a man who was not surprised to see her, but hadn't let himself expect her either. "I should have called," she said. "You didn't have to," he said. And then, "Maya's in the back." She came in. The house was the same as it had been in February. The same worn linoleum, the same flannel-covered couch, the same kitchen table geography that she had memorized over 2 days of sitting at it with colored pencils and a maintenance worker's calm. But there were small differences now in the way that spaces accumulate the evidence of being lived in. A new drawing Maya had made, stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a mountain, a stack of library books on the side table that hadn't been there before, a mug on the counter that was Cassandra's, that she had used both mornings she'd been here, that had been washed and returned to the cabinet, and that she noticed without saying anything. Maya appeared from the back of the house and stopped when she saw Cassandra. Her expression moved from surprise to assessment to a kind of careful pleasure that she managed the way her father managed things, without fully showing it. "Hi," Maya said. "Hi," Cassandra said. She held up the bakery bag. "I was told there are apple pastries from Linden's in here. I was informed this was important information." Maya's careful pleasure became something less managed. "Did you go to the actual Linden's?" "I did." "It's on the north side. That's like 40 minutes from where you work." "Yes." Maya looked at the bag and then at Cassandra and then briefly at her father, who was watching from the kitchen doorway with the dish towel and no expression Cassandra could read. Then Maya said, "Do you want to see the drawing I did? It's on the fridge." "I'd like that very much," Cassandra said. They sat at the kitchen table, the three of them, eventually, when Gideon brought coffee without being asked, and sat down in the chair across from Cassandra with his coffee and the dish towel still over his shoulder. Maya described the drawing with the careful detail of an artist explaining her own work. It was the view from the school bus window on the route she took home, a particular stretch of road where in winter the mountains were visible between two buildings, and she had tried to get the color of the sky right at that specific time of afternoon and wasn't sure she had. "You got the blue right," Cassandra said. "The mountains look like they're actually behind the buildings. That's hard to do." Maya looked at the drawing critically. "The snow is wrong, though. It looks too white. Snow doesn't actually look white up close." "What does it look like up close?" Maya thought about it. "Blue, kind of, or gray. Depends on the light." "That's very precise for someone your age." "Dad says if you're going to say something, say the right thing." Gideon drank his coffee. Cassandra looked at him over the rim of her mug and found him already looking at her, and they both looked somewhere else at approximately the same time. They spent 3 hours at that kitchen table. They ate the apple pastries. Maya talked about a project she was doing at school about the water cycle, which she had opinions about in the specific way of a child who has recently learned something and found it more interesting than she expected. Gideon talked about the porch boards he'd finally replaced that morning, a detail he mentioned the way people mention things they've been meaning to do for too long, with the mild satisfaction of completion rather than pride. Cassandra talked, eventually, about the plant that her receptionist had left on her desk, and why she had kept it, and the difficulty of explaining why that particular thing had mattered when larger gestures had not. "Sometimes it's the small ones," Gideon said, "because they're not looking for anything back." She looked at him. "The large gestures usually want something," he said. "Acknowledgement, reciprocity, proof that they landed correctly. The small ones, the ones that happen when somebody just felt something and acted on it without thinking about what it meant, those are different." Maya was looking between the two adults with the evaluative attention of a child watching a conversation she's not part of but is paying close attention to. "Like fixing someone's car in a parking garage," Cassandra said. Gideon looked at his coffee. "That was logistics," he said. "It wasn't only logistics." He didn't answer that. Maya, who had clearly decided she had absorbed enough of this exchange for one afternoon, announced that she was going to get more milk from the kitchen and took her glass and departed with the tact of a 9-year-old who had understood something her father wasn't going to explain. In the quiet of her absence, Cassandra said, "I want to offer you a job." Gideon set his mug down. "No." "You didn't let me describe it." "You're going to describe a security consulting position," he said, "or a director of corporate security role, or a VP of something that doesn't actually exist yet but that you'd create for this purpose. And it would be a good salary, and it would be important work, and it would require 60 hours a week minimum." She was quiet for a moment. "It would require 50, she said. "I've already thought about how to structure it." 50 hours a week is not Maya's father, he said, not harshly. As statement of fact, the same register he used for everything. "I've already done the version of myself that the job consumed before the person. I came back from it." He paused. "I'm not interested in a different version of the same trade." The words landed without softness and without apology, and she sat with them and did not try to argue with them because she recognized them as the truth, and because arguing with the truth was a habit she was working, with varying success, to break. "What if it was different?" she said. "Different how?" She chose her words with care. "What if it was your own firm, your structure, your terms? Work you chose, clients you vetted, hours you set. Consulting, not employment." She looked at him. "You're not a man who should be checking drainage grates in a parking garage, Gideon. You know that." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she heard Maya moving in the kitchen, the small sounds of a child opening a refrigerator, pouring milk. "I like the drainage grates," he said finally. She waited. "I like the building," he said. "I like the routine. I like knowing what every day is going to look like when I leave this house in the morning." He paused. "I built that deliberately, after everything before it." He turned the mug on the table slowly. "What you're describing, the consulting, the variable schedule, the new clients, that's a different life. I'd have to decide if I want a different life. And I'd have to not decide it today." She accepted this. It was not a no. It was not a yes. It was the answer of a man who was honest enough not to perform certainty he didn't have, and she had been surrounded for most of her professional life by people who performed certainty about everything, and the difference was significant. Maya came back with her milk and looked at the two adults and seemed to determine that whatever had been happening was now at a natural pause. "Can you stay for dinner?" she asked Cassandra. "Dad's making chili. It takes like 2 hours, but it's really good. He uses a specific kind of pepper." "Ancho," Gideon said, "and you're not supposed to tell people my recipes." "I didn't tell her the recipe, I just told her about the pepper." "That is the recipe." Maya considered this distinction with apparent sincerity, and then looked at Cassandra. "You should stay anyway." Cassandra looked at Gideon. He was looking at his daughter with the expression of a man who had been outmaneuvered by a 9-year-old and was not entirely displeased about it. "I'd like to stay," Cassandra said. She stayed for dinner and then for the hour after dinner, during which Maya showed her 3 more drawings and a science project she'd been working on involving the growth rates of different plants under different light conditions, and Gideon washed dishes with his back to the room and did not participate in the conversation except to interject corrections to Maya's description of the scientific method, and the house on Aldermore Street settled into the particular ease of an evening that wasn't trying to be anything other than what it was. When Cassandra left, Gideon walked her out to her car. It was a different car than the Escalade, a company lease, something lower and less conspicuous, though it was still the nicest vehicle on the block by a considerable margin. The February cold had deepened into March cold, which in Westbridge was not very different, and her breath clouded in the streetlight. "Thank you for the pastries," he said. Thank you for the chili." He stood with his hands in the pockets of his flannel shirt, not dressed for the temperature, apparently indifferent to it. She noticed he did this, stood outside in inadequate clothing as though the cold didn't register as something requiring response. "The job offer," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not saying yes," he said. "But I'm not saying no either. I need to think about what it would actually look like. The real version, not the version where I tell myself it would be fine and then find out it isn't." "That's fair," she said. "It might take a while to figure out." "I'm patient." He looked at her with the slight skepticism of a man who has read enough of her professional history to have doubts about this self-description. She almost laughed. It was real, not the controlled professional laugh she deployed in meetings, but the kind that arrives before you've decided to let it. "I'm working on being patient," she amended. "That's more honest," he said. She got in the car. He stepped back from the curb. She had started the engine and was about to pull out when she lowered the window. "Gideon." He looked at her. "Maya said something to me earlier when you were in the kitchen." She paused. "She said you laughed differently than you used to, that you started laughing differently a few weeks ago." She held eye contact. "I thought you should know that she notices." He stood on the sidewalk in the March cold without answering for a moment. "Drive safe," he said. She drove. The months that followed moved with the irregular rhythm of things that are becoming, rather than things that have been decided. Cassandra rebuilt the operational layer of Bellamy Medical methodically. New COO, a restructured oversight committee, an independent compliance function that reported directly to the board rather than through the executive chain. This was not comfortable work. Several people who had worked at the company for years found themselves in roles that were different or diminished, or in 3 cases, ended. She handled each of those conversations herself, rather than delegating them, because she had decided that managing at distance was a habit she could no longer afford. Warren Slade and his 2 board allies were indicted on 8 counts between them. The trial date was set. Warren's attorney was good, expensive, and experienced, but the documentation on the encrypted drive was the kind of comprehensive that good attorneys cannot wholly mitigate. Cassandra testified in a preliminary hearing in April. She was direct, and she was careful, and she was, by every account of the proceeding she received afterward, exactly as formidable as the situation required. The federal prosecutor told her legal counsel that she was one of the clearer witnesses he'd worked with in 12 years. She did not take this as a compliment so much as a baseline expectation she had managed to meet. What she worked harder on in those months was less visible. She started leaving the office at 7 instead of 9. She did not always succeed. When she failed, she started noticing that she had failed rather than accepting the hour as the natural endpoint of the day. She hired an executive assistant who pushed back. The 3rd candidate she'd interviewed, the one she'd initially passed over because his organizational style was less frictionless than she preferred, and discovered that friction from a person who was correct was more useful than smoothness from a person who agreed with everything. She went to the house on Aldermore Street on a Saturday twice a month, and then 3 times a month, and then the scheduling stopped being something she tracked because it became instead simply a thing that happened. She brought Maya books twice and coffee to Gideon once, a specific roast from a specific place he'd mentioned in passing and that she had remembered and tracked down, which she presented without ceremony and which he accepted without ceremony, but also without setting it aside the way he set aside things he didn't intend to use. In May, Gideon told her he'd been thinking about the consulting firm. He said it the way he said most important things, not as an announcement, just as a continuation of a conversation, as though they'd been discussing it 5 minutes ago rather than 2 months ago. "I talked to an attorney," he said, "about structure. Liability limits, licensing requirements for the state, whether my background clears the bonding requirements." He paused. "The bonding is fine. The licensing has some requirements I'd need to satisfy around corporate security consulting versus personal protection, different categories." "I know an attorney who specializes in that licensing category," she said. "If you want the referral." "I'd take the referral." She gave it to him. He called the attorney the following week. She knew this only because the attorney's office mentioned it when they called her about something else, not as a report, but as an incidental, the way professional connections surface in conversations. She did not mention that she knew. What she was learning, slowly and with some difficulty, was the specific discipline of not managing every outcome, of letting things develop at the speed they developed, rather than at the speed she could accelerate them to. This was harder than most of the professional challenges she faced, which at least had metrics. She and Gideon had dinner once without Maya, not deliberately without her, just an evening when Maya was at a school event and Gideon had come to pick Cassandra up from the building for the Saturday dinner they'd planned, and they'd ended up at a restaurant neither of them had chosen with any particular intention. It was a straightforward place, a diner 3 blocks from the plaza, the kind that did everything competently and nothing exceptionally. They sat across from each other in a booth with laminate menus that neither of them opened after the first minute, and they talked. Not about Warren, not about the trial, not about the consulting firm, or the company, or the board. They talked about other things. Maya's science project, which had been submitted and had received a response from her teacher that contained the phrase genuinely surprising, which Maya had reported with a combination of pleasure and affront. A book Cassandra had read on the plane to a conference in Seattle and had been unable to stop thinking about. A stretch of road north of Westbridge that Gideon had driven once and wanted to drive again when the weather cleared. A road that went up into mountain country and that he described in specific terms. The way the light fell at certain elevations, the particular silence of that altitude, that she hadn't expected from him and that she stored away without his knowing. Across the booth, in a diner that was too brightly lit and had a draft from the door, she watched him talk about a mountain road and thought about the parking garage. The cable, deliberately disconnected. The three men stepping out of the sedan. The maintenance worker who had not kept walking. She thought about what that had cost him, not in the physical sense, though that was real, but in the sense of everything he had built around his ordinary days. The deliberate ordinariness. The safety of routine. She had understood, over the months of knowing him, that the maintenance job was not failure, was not settling, was not a man of capability wasting himself in insufficient work. It was a man who had come home from something enormous and built the life that kept him capable of being present for a 9-year-old girl who noticed everything and needed him whole. She had walked into that life and complicated it. She was honest with herself about this. She was also honest with herself about the fact that when she drove away from Aldermore Street on Saturday evenings, the city between the house and her apartment felt longer than the distance. Gideon, across the booth, stopped talking about the mountain road and looked at her with the directness that she'd gotten used to and would now notice the absence of. "You went somewhere," he said. "I was thinking," she said. "About?" She looked at the laminate menu she hadn't opened, then at him. "About the fact that I walked into your life and complicated it, and I don't know if I've acknowledged that clearly enough." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't walk in," he said. "I opened the door." "You opened it because I was stranded." "I opened it because I chose to," he said. The stranded part was the occasion, not the reason. He held her gaze with the steadiness that she was convinced he didn't know was unusual. "There's a difference." She looked at him across the diner booth with the bad lighting and the draft from the door and the laminate menus, and thought about $3 billion and the Forbes profile and the 19 floors of a building she had built from nothing, and how thoroughly none of those things were present in this moment or necessary to it. "Okay," she said. He nodded as though something had been settled and picked up the menu. "The chili here won't be as good as mine," he said. "That's a very confident statement." "It's a realistic one." She opened her menu. "Order it anyway. I want to see if you're right." He was right. The chili was not as good. She told him so, which he received with the equanimity of a man who had been correct and saw no reason to be triumphant about it. They split a piece of pie at the end, apple, and argued briefly about whether the crust-to-filling ratio was defensible, and the diner stayed open late, and they did not notice the time until the server came by for the third time with the patience of someone being polite about closing. Outside on the sidewalk, in the March air that had finally softened into something that remembered spring was coming, Cassandra said, "I'm not going to keep pretending that coming to your house on Saturdays is about gratitude." Gideon stood on the sidewalk. "I know it started that way," she said. "Or I told myself it did. I'm not sure it was ever only that." He looked at the street, then at her. "No," he said, "it wasn't only that." She waited. "I don't have a clean answer for what it is," he said. "I should tell you that up front. I'm not a person who moves fast on things like this. I spent 4 years not moving at all." "I know." "Maya is—" "I know," she said again. "She's first. She should be first. I'm not asking you to change the order of things." He looked at her with the particular attention of someone checking whether a statement is true, and she held still under it because it was true, and she knew it was, and she could afford to let him verify it. "Okay," he said finally. It was the same word she'd said to him in the diner. It carried, she thought, approximately the same weight. Not conclusion, not beginning, but the specific acknowledgement between two careful people that something was real and did not need to be forced into a shape before its time. The street was quiet. A light changed down the block. The March air came off the mountains in the particular way it did in Westbridge, cool and carrying the smell of elevation. And Cassandra stood on the sidewalk outside a diner and did not try to manage what this was or what it would become, which was, for her, its own kind of achievement. They walked back to the building where she'd left her car. He walked beside her the way he did most things, without commentary, without filling the silence, present in the specific way of a man who had learned at some point that silence shared with someone was different from silence alone. At this parking garage entrance, a different level than B2, the visitor level, bright and ordinary, she turned to say goodnight. He was already looking at her. "Saturday," he said. "Saturday," she said. She went in. He walked back toward the street, and she watched through the garage entrance as he moved away down the block with his hands in his pockets. And she thought about a mountain road at high elevation and the way light falls at certain altitudes. And she thought that she had been building things for 9 years, and this was the first one she was content to build slowly. The trial lasted 11 days. Cassandra attended every session that her legal counsel did not actively discourage her from attending, which was most of them. She sat in the gallery in the kind of clothes she would have worn to any important meeting, not performing grief, not performing victory, just present, which was what she had decided presence meant when it mattered. Warren Slade sat at the defense table in a suit that was still good, still expensive, and that fit him the way expensive suits fit men who have lost weight under stress. A little loosely at the shoulders, a little long in the sleeve, evidence of a body that had been spending its reserves. She did not hate him. She had expected to. She had prepared in the way she prepared for most things, to feel something large and defined when she sat across a courtroom from the man who had spent 18 months dismantling her work from the inside and then tried to have her silenced in a parking garage. What she felt instead was something smaller and more tired. The feeling you get when you've been carrying a weight so long that putting it down doesn't produce relief, so much as the strange awareness of your own hands. The prosecution's case was thorough. The encrypted drive was entered into evidence. The forensic accountants testified. 2 of the 3 contractors from the garage accepted reduced charges in exchange for testimony, and their account of that Thursday evening, who had hired them, what they'd been told, what they'd been paid, was detailed and consistent and corroborated by the financial records that showed the payment trail running back through 3 shell accounts to a holding company Warren had established 14 months earlier. He had been planning it for a long time. That was the thing that had taken Cassandra the longest to absorb. Not the fraud itself, but the duration, the patience of it, the way he had sat across from her at executive meetings and strategy sessions and company dinners for over a year while building the mechanism of her removal. She had asked herself, in the months between the board meeting and the trial, what she had missed. What signals had been present that she hadn't read? This was not self-punishment. She had been deliberate about the distinction, because self-punishment and honest evaluation are not the same thing and produce different results. What she arrived at, after considerable thought, was that she had not missed signals so much as she had created conditions in which signals couldn't reach her. She had built a company where the people around her managed upward, told her what she needed to hear to function, protected her from friction, smoothed the path. She had rewarded this. She had not done it intentionally, but intention is a limited defense. Warren had understood her blind spots better than she had. That was perhaps the most uncomfortable truth of the whole proceeding, and she sat with it in the gallery of that courtroom on the 7th day of the trial and did not look away from it. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The verdict on 8 counts came back on a Tuesday morning in October. Guilty on 6, lesser findings on the remaining 2. Warren's 2 board allies had already accepted plea arrangements in August. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for January. Cassandra got the call from her legal counsel in her car, outside Maya's school, where she had driven Gideon that morning because his truck was in for a repair and the school was on the way to the plaza. She had arrived early and was waiting in the parking lot with the engine running and the heat on, watching 3rd and 4th graders cross the drop-off line in their coats. She listened to the verdict summary. She said thank you. She ended the call. She sat in the car for a moment. Then she called Gideon. He was at the building, she knew. Back at work, as he had been through all of it, the maintenance rounds and the drainage grates and the fluorescent fixtures and all the rest of the ordinary work of keeping a building functional. He picked up on the 2nd ring. Guilty, she said. 6 counts. A pause on the other end. Good, good, he said. Yes. Another pause. You okay? She looked at the crossing guard helping a small child across the drop-off lane, the child's backpack enormous relative to her body, the child apparently unconcerned. I think so, she said. I think I'm relieved, and I thought I'd feel more than that, but I think relief is actually what I have. That's enough, Gideon said. Is it? More than enough, he said. Relief means it's over. Over is what you needed. She thought about this. Outside, the crossing guard exchanged words with another parent, something that made both of them smile. I'll pick you up at 5, she said. You don't have to. Your truck is in for a repair, she said. I'll pick you up at 5. A pause in which she could hear the specific quality of a man deciding not to argue about something he's recognized as settled. 5, he said. She drove to the office. She called Francis Delacroix from the board, who had been waiting for the verdict with the patient concern of someone who understood that institutional outcomes have human costs on multiple sides. She cleared her afternoon calls and spent 3 hours with her compliance director reviewing the independent oversight structure they had implemented, not because the timing was required, but because it felt right to be doing the work of the rebuilt thing on the day the old threat was formally put to rest. At 3, she got up from her desk and looked at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 19th floor, the one with the view north toward the mountains, and she thought, I built this. I almost lost it. I didn't lose it. Now what? The now what was the question she'd been standing in front of for months. Not professionally. Professionally, she had answers, strategies, the rebuilt structure and the new COO and the compliance function and the employee support program she'd launched in September, a program supporting parents raising children alone, with flexible scheduling provisions and a childcare subsidy that had cost more than she'd originally budgeted and that she had not reduced the budget on. Professionally, she knew what she was doing. Personally, was different. Personally, she was still learning what the now what looked like for a woman who had spent 9 years building an empire and filling it with people who were useful rather than people who were real. She picked Gideon up at 5:15, which was 15 minutes late because a call had run long and she had not ended it early enough, which was a version of an old habit, and she said so when he got in the car. I know, she said. I'm working on it. I know you are, he said. And then, 15 minutes is better than it used to be. Which was true. And which was, from him, a form of encouragement that was calibrated to honesty rather than comfort, and she had learned to receive that calibration as something more valuable than the other kind. Gideon started the consulting firm in November. It was not a large launch. There was no announcement, no press release, nothing that marked it publicly as an occasion. He filed the paperwork in October, satisfied the licensing requirements. The attorney Cassandra had referred him to had been direct and practical, and Gideon had appreciated both qualities, bonded the firm, and began taking on his first 2 clients in November through referrals that came from people who knew him professionally and had apparently been waiting for him to be available in this capacity for some time. The first client was a mid-sized healthcare company that needed a vulnerability assessment of their physical security infrastructure. The second was a commercial property management group that had experienced 2 internal theft incidents and wanted independent analysis rather than the findings of a firm they'd hired. Gideon did both jobs himself, working methodically, writing reports that were detailed without being padded, the kind of reports that people read to the end because every sentence is there for a reason. He kept 4 days a week. He kept Maya's school schedule as the non-negotiable frame around everything else. He declined 2 clients in December because the scope they described would have required travel on school nights, and he declined them without significant internal conflict, which surprised him slightly, and then, on reflection, didn't. He also kept the maintenance supervisor position at Meridian Corporate Plaza through the end of the year, not because he needed the income, which had been manageable, but because he'd given 8 weeks' notice and he believed in finishing things. His last day was December 23rd. The building manager shook his hand and said, they hadn't had a facilities supervisor as thorough in 12 years. The woman at the front desk, whose name was Bev, gave him a card that everyone in the facilities team had signed, and he stood in the lobby with it for a moment before putting it in his pocket. He told Maya about the new firm one Sunday morning in November over breakfast, because he told Maya about things that affected her life, and he did it directly rather than at a managed distance. She listened. She asked 3 questions. What kind of work? How many hours? Did he have a name yet? And when he answered all 3, she nodded. Rourke Security Consulting, she said, trying the name. That's what I had. It sounds real, she said. Not like a business name someone made up. Like an actual thing. That's what I was going for. She looked at her cereal. Is Cassandra one of your clients? No. Maya absorbed this. Why not? Because she's not a client, he said simply. Maya's expression moved through something that she managed to keep mostly off her face, and then she said, okay, with the tone of someone who has drawn a conclusion and is content to let it remain unspoken. I was quiet for a moment. Does that bother you, Cassandra being around? She looked at him with the frank steadiness that she'd had since she was 4 years old. No, she said. She asks me questions and then she actually listens to the answers. Most adults don't do that. She paused. Also, she went to the actual Linden's for the pastries, on the north side. I know. That's 40 minutes. I know, Maya. She went back to her cereal. She really likes you, she said, in the tone of reporting an observable fact. Gideon drank his coffee. You really like her too, Maya said. Yes, he said, because she was 9 and she was his daughter, and she deserved honest answers, and also because it was simply true. And the truth had always been easier to carry than the alternative. Maya nodded once, the nod of someone checking an item off a list. Then she said, Can I have the last of the orange juice? Yes, he said. She got up to get it, and the Sunday morning continued in the ordinary way of Sunday mornings. And Gideon sat at his kitchen table with his coffee and the winter light coming through the window and felt the particular quality of a life that was still imperfect and still incomplete, and still, despite everything, going in the direction he'd almost stopped believing it could go. The anniversary of the night they met fell on a Thursday in February. Cassandra noted it on her calendar 3 weeks in advance, not with any specific plan attached to it, just the noting, the acknowledgement that it existed and that what had come after it existed because of it, and that those two facts together deserved something more than the ordinary passage of the day. She mentioned it to Gideon on a Saturday in late January. They were in the kitchen on Aldermore Street, Maya in the other room doing homework with the particular martyred energy of a child tackling a subject she found unreasonable. Cassandra had been helping Gideon with something that had, over several months, become an occasional Saturday ritual. He cooked, she sat at the counter and talked at him, and the arrangement suited them both because he did his thinking out loud less than she did, and the kitchen gave them both something to do with their hands. The 15th, she said. 1 year. He was at the stove and didn't turn around. I know. I thought we could go back, she said. B2, the parking space. He was quiet for a moment. Why? Because I want to stand in the place where it started, she said, and know how different everything is. I think that matters. He turned around with a dish towel over his shoulder. He looked at her at the kitchen counter. The blazer traded for a sweater she'd bought specifically because it was comfortable and that she wore to Aldermore Street and nowhere else. Her hair not constructed for anyone's purposes. A woman who had been worth $3 billion long enough that she'd started measuring other things. And he thought about a parking garage in February and a cable that had been deliberately disconnected and a choice he'd made in approximately 5 seconds that he had not once reconsidered. Okay, he said. And Maya, she said. I want Maya to come. He looked at her steadily. She'll ask questions. I know. She asks very specific questions. I know, Cassandra said. She gets it from you. He turned back to the stove. Okay, he said again. What? They went on a Thursday evening, the three of them, in Gideon's truck, the old one, 10 years old and meticulously maintained, which Maya had called dibs on the front seat for, and which Cassandra had conceded without argument, taking the back with the equanimity of someone who had revised her relationship with being in the passenger seat of anything. The plaza was quiet at that hour. The building's management had changed the evening security arrangements after everything that had happened. Better staffing, better protocols, the cellular repeater on B2 replaced and monitored. Gideon still had a relationship with the building, even after leaving the maintenance position. The new facilities supervisor had asked him twice for consults on infrastructure questions, which he'd provided, and which had produced the specific satisfaction of being useful in the work you actually know rather than the work you've been assigned. He badged them in through the service entrance, his consulting credentials still recognized, and they took the service elevator to B2. The garage at 9 on a February Thursday was the same as it always was. Fluorescent hum, concrete smell, the empty geometry of spaces designed for vehicles rather than people. The executive bay was partly occupied. Check. 2 cars, not Cassandra's Escalade. She'd traded that in months ago for reasons that were both practical and not entirely practical. The parking space where the Escalade had sat was empty. Cassandra stood in front of it. Maya stood beside her, looking at the empty space with the evaluating attention she brought to most things, and Gideon stood slightly behind them both with his hands in his coat pockets. "This is where it happened?" Maya asked. "Right here," Cassandra said. Maya looked at the space, then at the entrance ramp, then at the concrete pillar that still had, if you knew to look for it, a faint mark along its edge. "Dad took on 3 guys here?" "2 at first," Cassandra said. "Then things got more complicated." Maya looked at her father with the expression of someone adding a data point to a long-running assessment. "You never told me it was 3. You never asked specifically," Gideon said. "Dad?" "There were technically 2 and then a third came around the front of the car," he said. "It depends on how you count." Maya processed this and decided to let it go, which was a sign of maturity that Cassandra found both impressive and, given what she'd learned about the Rourke approach to information management, completely unsurprising. Cassandra looked at the parking space. The concrete was ordinary. The overhead light was humming its ordinary hum. There was nothing about it that looked like the beginning of anything. That was, she thought, the thing about the places where your life changes. They never look like what they are. They look like parking spaces and Thursday evenings and cable connections and 3 men stepping out of a black sedan, and the meaning of them is entirely invisible until afterward, when you stand in the same spot and look back at the distance you've traveled from it. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you'd kept walking," she said. Gideon said, "I know." "I'd still have my company," she said. "Probably I'd have found another way. I'm not someone who—" She paused. "I would have gotten through it some other way." "Yes," he said. "But I would have gotten through it alone," she said. "I'd have won the company and not known what I was missing." She turned and looked at him. "I didn't know I was missing anything. That's the part I keep coming back to. I genuinely didn't know." He met her eyes with the steadiness she had come to depend on. Not a crutch, not a prop, but the specific reliability of a person whose steadiness comes from having tested himself against things that required it and having held. "Neither did I," he said quietly. Maya was looking at the exit ramp, pretending to find the engineering of it interesting. She was not actually interested in the engineering of it. Cassandra smiled. It was not a public-facing smile, not the one in the magazine photographs, not the one she deployed in board meetings. It was the smaller one, the one that arrived before she'd authorized it. "You should have kept walking," she said. "No," he said. "I shouldn't have." They married in September, 10 months later. Not in a venue, not in a place chosen for its significance to anyone outside the 3 of them. Gideon had suggested, with the characteristic brevity of a man who had thought about something for a long time and arrived at a simple conclusion, that the ceremony should be at a place that meant something real rather than something appropriate. Cassandra had agreed without requiring any clarification, which was itself evidence of how much had changed in the year and a half between a parking garage and this question. They were married outdoors on a clear Saturday in September, at the trailhead of a path north of Westbridge that led up into mountain country. The road Gideon had described to Cassandra in a diner booth over substandard chili, the one he'd said he wanted to drive again when the weather cleared. He had driven it again twice, and the second time he'd brought Cassandra and Maya had spent the drive with her face against the window saying nothing, which was how she responded to things she found genuinely beautiful rather than things she found merely impressive. The ceremony was attended by 17 people. Francis Delacroix from the board, who had called Cassandra 2 weeks after the parking garage incident and become, gradually and without either of them planning for it, something that functioned like a mentor. Not the instrumental kind, but the kind that tells you when you're wrong and asks after your health in the same sentence. The attorney who had helped Gideon with the consulting firm's licensing. Ray Kowalski from down the street, who had lent Gideon his Honda without asking questions, and who stood in his good coat with the slightly overwhelmed expression of a man who had not expected to be at this event when he loaned out his car. Marcus Tran, the security guard, who had cooperated fully with investigators and kept his job, and who had appeared on Gideon's consulting firm's roster 6 months later as a licensed security analyst, because Gideon believed in working with people who had demonstrated the capacity to be honest about their mistakes. Maya stood beside Cassandra through the ceremony. She wore a blue dress that she had picked herself after 3 trips to 3 different stores, which Cassandra had attended without steering, because she had understood from early on that with Maya the correct approach was to provide options and then get out of the way. The dress was the right blue, the blue Maya had described once, sitting at the kitchen table, as the color snow actually looks close up. She held Cassandra's hand during the vows, not because she was asked to, but because she reached for it, and Cassandra had held on. Gideon said his vows in the way he said most things, directly, without ornamentation, in the voice of a man who does not say things he doesn't mean, and therefore when he says them, they carry the weight of everything he hasn't said leading up to that moment. He did not manage his expression. He made no effort to maintain the stillness that was his default. He looked at Cassandra in the September light on the side of a mountain and said the words that were true, and his voice was not entirely level at the end of them, and he did not apologize for that. Cassandra said her vows, looking at him, and at Maya, and at the mountains above them, and she thought about a cable deliberately disconnected, and a maintenance worker who had chosen not to keep walking, and a 9-year-old who had offered her a sweatshirt and asked if she wanted hot chocolate. She thought about all the things she had built, and how none of them had built this, and how this was the thing that made the building of everything else make sense, not because it completed her in the way that stories sometimes promise completion works, but because it gave her something outside the building itself to return to, which turned out to be what she'd needed all along without knowing that needing was allowed. She did not cry. She had expected she might. What she felt instead was something calmer and more permanent, the feeling of a person who has arrived at a place she did not know she was traveling to, and who recognizes it when she gets there. When it was over, Maya said, "That was good." Gideon said, "High praise." Maya said, "I'm serious. Some people's wedding vows are really boring. Yours weren't." Cassandra looked at the 9-year-old, 10 now, since August, a fact she had been present for, and that still occasionally surprised her with how much she minded it, and felt the specific fullness of a moment that had too many things in it to hold separately, and so you simply hold them all at once. "Thank you," she said. "That means a lot." "I know," Maya said, which was her father's phrase delivered with his cadence, and which made Gideon look away toward the mountains briefly and swallow once. They ate lunch at a long table that Ray Kowalski and Marcus had set up at the trailhead, a practical arrangement rather than a catered one, food brought in boxes and laid out on a table with a cloth that Maya had chosen. It was imperfect in the specific ways that things arranged by people rather than professionals are imperfect. The cloth had a corner that kept lifting in the mountain breeze. 2 of the folding chairs were less stable than the others. The coffee went lukewarm faster than anyone planned. Nobody minded. The conversation ran long and loud and occasionally across itself, the way conversations do when the people at the table have been through enough together that they do not need to manage their presence in each other's company. At one point, Cassandra looked down the table and found Gideon in conversation with Marcus about something she couldn't hear, and she watched him. The stillness that was still there, but had a different quality now, less barricade and more simply character, the way a person's particular nature looks when it's been lived in rather than deployed. He laughed at something Marcus said, the real laugh. The one Maya had first noticed months ago and had told Cassandra about in the parking garage conversation, that Cassandra still thought about as one of the most quietly significant things anyone had ever said to her. She watched him laugh and thought, this is what was on the other side of that cable. There is something that does not appear in any profile of Cassandra Bellamy, in any board summary, in any of the coverage that followed the conviction of Warren Slade and the subsequent stabilization and growth of Bellamy Medical Technologies. It does not appear there because it is not the kind of thing that appears in those places, and because the people who would have written it didn't know it. In the year after the trial, Cassandra restructured the employee support program she'd launched in September into something larger and more specific. It provided flexible scheduling and childcare subsidies for parents raising children alone. Yes, that was the original version. But she added to it a provision that her compliance director had initially questioned and then, upon hearing her reasoning, had not questioned further. A job security guarantee for any employee who reported internal misconduct in good faith, regardless of what that reporting cost the company in the short term. The guarantee was binding and independently administered, and it cost more than the child care subsidy. She had done this because of what she had not reported in time and because of what it had cost. She had also done it because of a maintenance supervisor who had chosen not to keep walking, and the specific implication of that choice, that sometimes the right action is not the one that protects you, and that a company which only rewards self-protective behavior will eventually produce a culture in which no one reports what they should. The program was, in the year after its full implementation, used 3 times. Each time, the report was accurate and material and reached the right people at the right speed. Each time, the employee who filed it kept their job. Each time, the thing that had been reported was addressed. Cassandra did not publicize this. She kept the numbers, because she kept all numbers, but she did not put them in the annual report or the stakeholder communication or any of the documents that described Bellamy Medical's performance to the world. It was not, she had decided, a story she was telling to the world. It was a practice she was maintaining in the company. That distinction mattered. Gideon's consulting firm grew slowly, the way he had intended it to. He took on 2 additional consultants in the second year, both vetted carefully, both former military with the specific combination of technical skill and ethical grounding that Gideon considered non-negotiable, and he declined clients at roughly the same rate he accepted them. He had developed, among the corporate security community in Westbridge and eventually the broader region, a reputation for the thing that reputations take the longest to build: reliability. Not the reliability of the vendor who always answers the phone, but the reliability of the person whose findings you can trust, because they will tell you what they found regardless of whether you want to hear it. He was home for dinner 4 nights out of 5. On the 5th night, Cassandra was usually the one who came home late, because 4 years of marriage did not fully dissolve 9 years of habit, and some of her hours were simply who she was. Gideon kept a plate in the oven on those nights. He did not do this to make a point. He did it because she was hungry when she came home, and keeping a plate warm was a practical expression of a thing he didn't generally express in speeches. Maya, at 11, had opinions about most things, and shared them with the full confidence of a person who has been told since childhood that her thinking is worth taking seriously, which created a specific kind of challenge in household negotiation, but which Cassandra had decided early on she would not dilute. The world needed more people who had been told their thinking was worth taking seriously at age 9. She was not going to be the one to undo that. On a Wednesday evening in March, 2.5 years after a parking garage, 1.5 years after a mountain ceremony, on an ordinary Wednesday that was not an anniversary or an occasion, Maya was at the kitchen table doing homework, Gideon was washing dishes, and Cassandra was at the counter on her laptop doing the 30 minutes of end-of-day catch-up that she'd negotiated down from 90, when Maya said, without looking up from her homework, "I think people are wrong about what makes a family." Gideon didn't turn from the sink. "How so?" "They think it's about who's related," Maya said, "but it's more about who shows up." She erased something on her paper. "Like, related people don't always show up, and sometimes people who aren't related show up all the time, and that's what it actually is." The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of water and the scratch of an eraser. Cassandra looked at her laptop screen and did not type anything. "Yeah," Gideon said from the sink. "That's about right." Maya went back to her homework. Gideon finished the dishes. Cassandra closed her laptop. Not finished, but done for the night, which was a distinction she'd learned to make, and sat at the kitchen counter in the house on Aldermore Street, while the March wind came off the mountains, and the baseboard heaters cycled on, and the light above the kitchen table held them all in its ordinary range. There are people who spend their whole lives building the right things and arrive at the end of it with the correct version of success and discover that success is a room you can be alone in. And there are people who built everything for the wrong reasons and only find out what the right reasons are late, in a parking garage on a Thursday night, when someone who could have kept walking didn't. Neither of those people gets everything right. The man still wakes at 2 in the morning sometimes and lies in the dark remembering things he can't undo. The woman still misses dinners, still checks her phone in conversations, still has the residue of 9 years of building armor in places she's still learning to leave unprotected. The girl still carries the weight of knowing what loss is earlier than any child should. None of them are fixed. None of them are finished. But they are here, in this kitchen, on this Wednesday, and the here is real, and the Wednesday is real, and the family, assembled from a disconnected battery cable and a choice made in 5 seconds in a February parking garage, is as real as anything that was built more deliberately. That is not a small thing. In fact, if you were to ask any of the 3 people in that kitchen what the right word for it was, they would probably each give you a different answer. Maya would give you the most accurate one. She usually did. But the word they would all agree on, if pressed, is this: enough. More than enough.